Hi everyone, I'm Amna Nawaz in New York. Well, this weekend marked 5 years since one of the deadliest hate crimes in U.S. history. 5 years ago, a man with ties to a white supremacist group walked into a house of worship in Wisconsin and killed 6 people before he himself was shot. That community is still reeling but recovering. We're going to hear how they are doing today and what this means for the rest of American communities right here today. Joining me in studio is Simran Jeet Singh, who is the Senior Religion Fellow with the Sikh Coalition. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You have been in touch with the folks of Oak Creek, Wisconsin. For those who don't recall, this was a Sikh American community that was targeted specifically for their religion 5 years ago. How are they doing today? How did people there mark the anniversary?
I think we can say they're doing well, given the circumstances. It's a resilient community. That's something we've seen over the past 5 years. And what we're seeing from them is a thinking seriously about the urgent issues of hate violence in our country, but also trying to find optimism in this current political climate. So this weekend, the community gathered. They did worship services, and in our tradition, in the Sikh tradition, we do that through singing. So it's a lively sort of remembrance program. It's beautiful. They organized a 6K run, which they've been doing every year, and as a way of sort of getting people active and moving and the call to action. So that's a nice tradition they've had there. And another thing we're seeing is there have been National Day of Seva projects organized by the Sikh Coalition. And what we try and do there is bring local communities together with other communities where people can meet Sikhs but also engage in service at the same time, because that's the core value.
This idea of seva that not enough people know about, explain that for us.
Yeah, in our tradition, seva is, the word seva means action. It means selfless and loving service, and it's a core part of who we are as people. So the idea is, why don't we take this core value of seva and use that as a way to bridge relationships with other people while also making our own communities better.
Talk to me a little bit about how things have changed there, if at all. Because I remember reading over the years, every year on the anniversary, we go back and remember that horrific day, and everyone heard those 911 calls, and they've heard some of the details, and they've heard some of the stories of the people who lost loved ones, of the people who survived being shot and still live through that on a daily basis. But I also remember one detail about some of the bullet holes, about how everyone went back into the Gurdwara, call it a temple if that's appropriate, and fixed most of the bullet holes, right? Patched most of them up, but they left one. Tell me about that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the idea is history is important, right? And memory is important, and I don't think it does any of us any good to forget when these sorts of things happen, right? We need to remember them, and we need to hold them up. Moments like these, the moment we start forgetting about instances of hate and the patterns that are present in our society, that's the moment we stop actually doing the work to make our communities healthier, right? To make ourselves stronger. And so that bullet hole is a reminder to all of us that this is real. Hate in our country is real. Discrimination is real. And it's something we have to deal with urgently.
And that bullet hole, I remember reading, they actually marked with a plaque, right?
That's right, and the plaque is still there.
With the date, and the plaque reads, "We are one."
We are one, right? And that's our tradition. You know, the very first words in the Sikh scripture points to the oneness of the universe. So we say Ik Onkar, the oneness of reality. And the idea there in our tradition is that all people are connected through this idea of oneness. It's a singular humanity, a singular family. And that oneness we have to remember, because the moment we start becoming divided, that's when things start falling apart.
You mentioned hate crimes. I want to play a soundbite that goes back a little bit that speaks to just that and talk about it on the back end. But it's something from one of the members of the community who was affected. It was a young man who actually lost his mother in the massacre on that day, who that same year, as an 18-year-old, went before Congress, before a Senate committee, and actually testified, right, about hate crimes and the need to track them in a particular way. Take a listen to the soundbite.
Senators, my mother was our biggest fan, our biggest supporter. She was always there for us. She always had a smile on her face. But now she's gone. Because of a man who hated her, because of she wasn't his color, his religion. I just had my first day of college, and my mother wasn't there to send me off. She won't be there on my graduation or my wedding day. She won't be able to meet her grandchildren. I want to tell the gunman who took her away from me, you may have been full of hate, but my mother was full of love. She was an American, and this was not our American dream.
So there you have a soundbite there from Harpreet Sahni, who testified just as an 18-year-old, which is incredible. In the same year, he lost his own mother in that shooting. But this, you talked about hate crimes a little bit before. I want to dig into it a little bit now, which is to say that hate crimes against Sikh Americans in particular haven't been tracked until 2015, moving on. And that is despite the fact that largely this community has borne the brunt of a lot of the growing Islamophobia and xenophobia that we've seen over the last decade plus.
That's right. And frankly, it's not a new phenomenon either, right? Sikhs came to this country over a century ago. The first race riot targeting Sikhs specifically occurred in 1907 in Washington. So hate violence targeting Sikhs is not new. And it's amazing to me that more than a century later, we're still fighting to be recognized, to even be a statistic in hate crime tracking. It's remarkable. I think a lot of the Sikh American experience, our story here, has been a quest to be recognized as people. Right? It's a strange phenomenon when I walk around the streets, when I here in New York City. Everybody sees me. They see my turban. I stick out in a crowd, but they don't know who I am. So it's a very strange sort of being noticed but going unnoticed at the same time. It's a very strange feeling.
Well, why do you think that is? I mean, you mentioned that hate crime dating all the way back to 1907. We've all seen the numbers now. You've heard anecdotally the stories, right? Just last year, there was a man in California who had his turban ripped off and his hair cut. Those men, I think, were actually convicted of a hate crime and sentenced to prison. There were stories, one earlier in March, about another man, a Sikh man who was targeted. Why do these things keep happening? Why do you think it's not necessarily getting better?
I think, well, there are a few things we could point to. I think religious literacy is a big problem here in this country. People don't know who their neighbors are. We don't know about different cultures, different religions, different languages. And that lack of education creates a real problem because we then develop a fear of the other. I think another problem we're seeing in this country right now is our political leadership is not taking a stand against hate. We're actually seeing our leadership fueling the flames of hatred, of xenophobia, the anti-immigrant rhetoric, the anti-Muslim rhetoric. It puts a lot of pressure on certain communities. And people now feel emboldened to treat people as less than human on the basis of their identities. So I'm feeling that personally. I'm receiving far more hate speech, hate incidents I encounter. A lot more of those now than I ever have before.
You're seeing that just on your own, your social media, on your email? Where are you seeing
That's right.
that?
Personally, when I'm out on the streets, people say things now.
What do people say to you?
Some things that I can't repeat on the air, but racial slurs more commonly. Usually, most of the hate that I receive is in moments where people presume that I'm Muslim because of my identity. The fact of the matter is, in modern America, anybody who looks Muslim is perceived to be the enemy now. So if I have a turban and a beard as a Sikh, people look at me and they treat me like I'm inferior or as if I'm a threat to them. And that's a huge problem.
Another group, not the Sikh Coalition with which you work, the National Sikh Campaign, launched a $1.3 million, basically a PR campaign, right? With TV ads and a number of other outreach efforts, just to sort of educate their fellow Americans about what it means to be Sikh in America today. And it's not the first effort we've seen like that, right? A few years ago, there was another organization that did something similar for the Sikh community. Do these things help, first of all? I mean, does it all sort of help in some way? And also, what does it say about us that in 2017, there still has to be an American community that takes out ads just to tell people, hey, this is who we are, this is what we're about.
Right, and stop attacking us, please.
And please stop attacking us, yes.
Right, yeah. No, I think the spirit of it is essentially recognizing, right, in our tradition we believe that people are good, and we believe that they're misguided in their attacks. And so education then becomes a solution because we can provide solace for those who we believe have heavy ignorance within them. So education is important. So I think that's the spirit behind these sorts of efforts. But I think it also speaks to the discomfort that Sikhs in this country have, that here we are, the world's 5th largest religion, nearly 30 million practitioners of Sikhism around the world, and we still can't get people's attention enough. So we need to raise millions of dollars to just put out commercials. You know, it's a bizarre sort of experience to be in the middle of that.
You mentioned the Islamophobia and the sort of people's lack of understanding, and the fact is that for people who don't know enough about Sikhism or Islam, they often conflate the two, right? And just this past weekend, it's worth noting, in Minnesota, on the anniversary of the shooting in Wisconsin, there was a very serious attack against a mosque in Minnesota, right? An improvised explosive device thrown through the window there. We've seen a rise in those kinds of incidents as well. And I wonder how you think, you know, aside from continuing to educate people about what it means to be Sikh, about the generations and generations of history here just in this country, how do you sort of separate the two? How do you kind of remind people this is not the same?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an interesting question, and I think our community has been grappling with this. And my question in response is, does that even matter, right? Like, yes, I think for many of us in this community right now, we feel a need to educate people about who we are as Sikhs, and we're doing that. But when it comes to these instances of hate that we experience in moments where people see us as Muslims, it doesn't matter to me as much whether they know that I'm Sikh or not. What matters to me in that moment is that we address the problem of hate at its core. So in many instances, including a few recently, I haven't even identified myself as a Sikh when I've been targeted in hate because someone presumed me to be a Muslim. In those moments, I stop and talk and explain why I think their racism is wrong. And that, I think, is the step number one that we need to address as a society. And then we can start getting into that. Here are the differences between these communities. But I think that's far removed from where we are in this moment.
What do you say to people? I think a lot of people would be curious to know when someone says something so hateful and awful to your face, what do you say to them?
It's tough. It depends on context. In certain situations where safety is not present, you know, I usually don't say anything. But for example, in a recent incident, somebody called me a slur, including the word Osama, with a few additional descriptors before that. And I stopped and talked to him and you know, essentially explained to him he was a young teenager, and so I felt like I had an opportunity to talk to him. It's especially painful when it's kids, and I feel a need and a responsibility.
Because they're probably just parroting back things that they've heard somewhere else.
That's right, exactly. And so I just stopped, and you know, he knew he was wrong, and he knew what he was saying was wrong, and so
probably
it was very,
didn't expect to be called out on
exactly.
it either.
So it was very easy to just stop and say, hey, you know, I don't appreciate you saying that, and it's hurtful, and you know, this is a different form of racism that you don't appreciate, that you know is not acceptable in our society. And it was fine, and he apologized, and we shook hands, and yeah, it was great. It was very nice. Not every moment has a happy ending.
I was going to say, do they all go that way?
but that was a good moment, and I think, you know, for me, in moments where dehumanization are the problem, then really working on the humanizing aspect, right? Dealing and treating with other people as humans and connecting with them on a human level, that's a solution, I think.
On that same point, on the anniversary, there was an essay written and published by a gentleman who lived in Oak Creek, was raised there. His father was one of the victims in the shooting. His father is Baba Punjab Singh. He was shot in the head in that shooting, miraculously survived. This son, Raghuvinder Singh, actually flies back and forth between his home in New Jersey and Oak Creek on a monthly basis just to check in and care for his father. He wrote an essay, and I want to read back to you something that he said, which was that Sikhs, like many other religious minorities, have been an integral part of the American fabric for generations. We are your colleagues, your classmates, and your neighbors, not your enemies. And it's such a simple, basic line, and yet so powerful, because it strikes me that it still needs to be said today. So I'm wondering what you think about how that changes. You talked about the dehumanizing efforts and knowing your neighbors. How does that actually change? How do you do that?
I mean, I think it has to be done on a grassroots level where people in their own local communities are engaging with other people. I think that's where it has to happen because, look, it's not going to happen on a policy level. It's not happening on a national level. These changes really happen when we connect with one another as humans. I think in moments where we are criminalizing people based on their identities, the only solution to that is really knowing people with direct human contact, right? And studies have shown this to us over and over again. My own personal experiences, my friends now have told me when they first met me, they didn't know anybody who looked like me and they were fearful. And over time they got over that because they got to know me. So I think that's the only way we really begin changing the way we fear one another, is that we connect with one another on a deeper level and say, okay, these are just normal people.
Are families in Oak Creek worried something else like that could happen again? Is there any fear there?
I think families everywhere around the country are worried. In the Sikh religion, we have this ideal that we don't live in fear. One of our first words in our scripture is nirbo, that we believe God is without fear and that therefore we should be fearless. But in this moment, that's tough. It's a tough ideal to live up to when there is real concern that anything could happen at any time. You know, people walking out of their house and going to work, you could be the next target of a hate crime, and it could be hate speech and something that's relatively minor, or it could be a murder. And we're seeing all sorts of things happen in this country. So it's hard in this context not to be constantly vigilant, not to be on high alert. And when that idea is at the forefront of your consciousness, or even in the back of your mind at all times, that really changes the way that you live your life in this world, right? We're trying to live with integrity and self-respect without letting this hate really affect us on a day-to-day level. But knowing in the backs of our minds that people on the street see us as targets, as enemies, that has real serious implications for us.
Here's hoping all your work and effort continues to make a difference, I should say.
Thank you. Thank you.
Simran, Jeet, Singh, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks to all of you for watching as well. Remember, you can go to abcnews.com anytime for more on this story and many others. For now, I'm Amna Nawaz, and I'll see you back here soon.